Hey guys, it's Lisa with Are You My Cousin? And it is Thursday, so it's time for another live stream where we can come and chat about our genealogy research. Now, today's topic, we are going to be talking about some of those unusual places that we have found our genealogy records. We found evidence of our ancestors. But before we get into that, I'll do a little bit of housekeeping just to make sure, give everybody a chance to find us and to get on to the live stream as well. Hey, Lily. Oh, you're here again from Southern Mississippi. Thank you so much for showing up each week, Lily. I really do appreciate that. It also is nice if you guys enter like Lily did. If you don't mind just telling me where you're from or just a hello, it just lets me know that you guys can hear and see the live stream and that everything is working properly. So, and again, if you are just joining us, thank you so much for coming. I really do appreciate that. Feel free, if this is your first time here, welcome. And if you have any questions as we go along, if you want to make a comment, please feel free to do that in the, just make a comment and I will see those come up to the side of my screen and I'll stop periodically and check those and make sure I'm answering questions for folks so that we get as much as we can out of this. Because guys, I do this because I want to make sure that you guys are getting what you need to further your genealogy research. So today I am sitting in my office in North Carolina and I'm looking at some very gray skies and had a lot of rain today. And so what better time than to just sit and talk genealogy and do some research as well. Okay, guys, so as we go along today, and before we get into too deep, I do want to ask a favor. When we start talking in just a minute about some of those really unusual places to find our ancestors, I would love it if you would think about maybe the most unusual place you have found evidence, whether it's an unusual record, whether it's just an odd location that you have found records or evidence of your ancestors. And I would love for you to put it in the comments section because this is something that I think we can learn from each other and maybe get some creative juices flowing. So that'll be, we'll be talking about that in just a minute after the announcements. Hey, Dave is here again from Renton, Washington. We've got Danya from Georgia again. Yay. And hey, Louise from Japan. Yes, Louise was on our call last night. We are international now with our Louise is from Japan. So thank you so much for joining us. Louise, I do have to ask what time it is in Japan because I'm not very good with my time changes. Okay, so welcome. A couple of announcements up front here. I'm just continuing to put out content for you guys, blog posts, new YouTube videos are coming out each week, at least twice a week on YouTube. So be sure and follow the YouTube channel if you want to subscribe before we, when you get off at the end of the YouTube live today, feel free. Go ahead and subscribe. That way you won't miss any videos as I put them out there for YouTube. I am trying to do more of those because I think people seem to enjoy those. And if there are topics you would like, feel free to let me know. Last night, we did do the Vivid Pics webinar last night that Vivid Pics and I put on. And so thank you so much for those of you who came. If you weren't able to come, don't worry. There'll be a replay of it. It'll actually be over on Vivid Pics, and I will let you know when that occurs and when it's ready. I'll be sure and post that in my social media on the website as well as in then your weekly email for that. With that, though, I did want to tell you guys that Vivid Pics has a special link with I believe it's 20% off for Are You My Cousin readers, and I'll pop that link in the chat box for you. That's just through the end of May, and just in full disclosure, it is an affiliate link for me. So just to let you guys know that if you're interested. So let's get started on our topic today. Louise, it's 4 a.m. in Japan. Gracious, thank you so much. I feel privileged that you are up so bright and early to join us today. Thank you. Hey, Faye, it's nice to see you again. Debbie, yay. Debbie, I'm not sure. I'll have to work on that. There should be a direct link that you can get to us pretty easily. I'll check on it, though, and follow up on that as well. Okie doke. Here we go. We are talking about those unusual places to find our ancestors and some of the more unusual records. I think I've been doing this a lot of years now, and I have had some very unusual experiences. I have found ancestors in some places where, well, they shouldn't be, or I didn't think they should be. And so just some different odd records that I might not have looked in or just really kind of fell into by happenstance. And again, if you were just joining me, I would really appreciate it if you have some really unusual places you found your ancestors. Please put those in the comments, because I'd love for this to be kind of a time for sharing and helping each other out. So I'm going to go ahead and share some of mine as you guys are thinking through that and want to pop yours in the comments. One of the strangest places I found mine, and I guess it wasn't so much a strange place, it's just an unusual occurrence, was actually in a library. And I was researching a particular family line, and somebody had said, you know what, if you go check out this book that's down at the state library, you will find some information on your ancestors. So I did, and it was a very well-written family history. It was on the Richardson, actually it was on the Collie family out of Pennsylvania County, Virginia, C-O-L-L-I-E, not the puppy dogs, but the Collie family. And they actually intermarried with my Richardson side of the family, and they said, you're going to find a lot of family history. And sure enough, I did find a lot of history. And as I went through that, not only did I find my ancestors, I started going through that thing, and well, behold, I was listed in that book. So I thought, okay, that's really crazy. At first I thought, oh my gracious, that is the coolest thing. I am listed in the family history that somebody wrote. And then I thought, that is the weirdest thing. I was really excited, and then I was like, that's kind of strange, because here I am in this family history. But I went so far back, obviously it came full circle, and I found myself. So I thought that was an unusual way to really start. That was very early in my genealogy research. It really kind of got me going, per se, on some of that. So that was an interesting place to find that. Now, another unusual record that I would not normally think to look in experience, I was in the basement, and I do mean the basement of the county courthouse up in Halifax County, Virginia, and going through some records, and was really a little bit at my, I wouldn't say a roadblock, but you know how you kind of get to that point, you're just like, I don't know where else to look. So I happened to pick up an index that I would not normally pick up. It was just kind of the last in a stack. I wasn't really paying attention to what that index was. And it turned out to be the grand jury indictments index. And I found my ancestor there. I was like, wait a minute, I found my ancestors here. And so I did pull the originals out, and sure enough, not only did I find them listed, that was the piece of the puzzle that told me and kind of got my research going on those troublesome great grandparents who had not married, because it was a grand jury indictment. They were living in adultery. And that was the piece of the puzzle that really sort of got me going, like, whoa, what just happened? I'm standing here. This was not what I expected. And it turned my research, honestly, in the right direction. I'd been going in the wrong direction, and that piece of the puzzle got me going in the right direction. Never expected to think grand jury that they would be, of doing that type of thing. So that was an interesting way to go. Another really interesting thing that I found one time, I'd been researching several years. I was, still kind of a new genealogist, I think, in respect, but I've been doing it for several years. And I went into the state library downtown of North Carolina and walked in, and they always had this really cool display. It was just a table, and it had books, and they had their new books displayed, or maybe I think these were all new books. And I always stopped. Anytime I ever go, I always stop and look, because there usually is something that maybe I haven't seen before. It's something, maybe a topic I'm not familiar with. Well, this particular day, they had a new book out, and had it on its nice little book stand, and it was Wake County, North Carolina road records. So it was transcriptions and digital photographs of those road records. And I thought, wait a minute, road records? What are road records? So I picked up the book, thumbed through it, and within the first literally 60 seconds of going through there, I found not just my ancestor, not just my 5th great-grandfather, I found my 4th great-grandfather listed in there, and all the collaterals on the road record. This was the first time I had ever heard of a road record. And again, I was still kind of new, but I was thrilled to find that. So I did what every good genealogist does. I went straight upstairs to the archives where the records were and asked to see the original record. But the book was a fantastic. The transcription was excellent and gave me a lot of the information I needed. So it was just, I never ever thought until that point to check for a road record on finding my ancestor. And what that road record did in this case, this was their petition to Wake County to create a road in a certain area, part of the county going, I forget, it was quite a distance, but everybody along who lived in that area and wanted that road had signed it and signed that petition, and it told me who lived where. It told me what part of the county they were at. It told me kind of, and that road exists today in Wake County, and so I know exactly where that road is now, and I can put my ancestors along that road. So it was a really interesting place. I'd never ever considered looking for a road record, but that's an important piece of the puzzle. So Debbie put in here that the book El Dorado in a shot glass, that your ancestor was the owner of a bar in Sacramento, California during the gold rush. That is so cool. So you found it in an actual book. That is really interesting. I like that idea, that your ancestor is the owner of a bar in during the gold rush. That is a really interesting thing. I would love to hear some of those stories on that. And that brings up an interesting thing too, Debbie, that kind of brings to mind. I actually read a book recently. I saw it mentioned recently too. It's called, hang on one second. It's on my bookshelf somewhere. I actually don't see it, but it's about Henrietta Lacks, and I think it's called the immortal sales of Henrietta Lacks, something of that. And she actually was out of Halifax County, Virginia. She lived there, and the whole autobiography, when I read the story, and it's a lot about her cells she had cancer, and her cancer cells were the ones that were used to create cancer treatments, and it's a very the medical ethics are involved, and it's an amazing read. But it also told her story and her family story, and because she lived in the same area where my ancestors did, I actually gained a lot of social history about the times. So while it didn't mention my ancestors specifically, it did tell me a lot about the cultural history that was involved during the early 1950s, 40s and 50s, and so it was a nice way to learn more about that particular area, as well as it gave a lot of references in the back of the book. And so then I took those references, and then I used those references to find more information about my ancestors. So that was an interesting thing as well. So has anybody used road records? If you have, let me know in the comments. I'd love to know what you've used and if you found those helpful or not. The other thing is you can find the petitions, but you can also find the listings for the road crews, which you'll find in the county court records. So if you're thinking of looking at road records, check both of those places. So it could be a petition or for the building of a road or the building of a bridge, or check for the county court records where they named the road crews, because those were the crews that would take care of the roads. They were for the upkeep of the roads, and they would be close to the area where they lived, so that they would have that. Yeah, Debbie, you see that the Henrietta? You should read that book if you haven't. That's great. Oh, so Lily's never heard of the road records. Yeah, they're really helpful, because what the road records do, you won't really think about it, but if you were assigned to a road crew, if your ancestor was assigned to the road crew, and these, again, there was an overseer named at the county court level. I think they were usually once a quarter, depending on the area. They would name the road crew. They would name the overseer of that road crew. And those were the people who would take care of that road, because think about it, it wasn't the nice paved roads that we have today. Obviously, they were dirt roads, and I'm sure the weather would make them difficult at times to pass. And so when you were named to a road crew, make sure you look at who else was named alongside of your ancestor, because you're very likely going to find collateral ancestors. You might find a brother. You might find a couple generations. You might find father and son named on both on the same record. And what that does is it tells you about your ancestors' community and tells you about where they live, because it's going to tell you what road and what part of the road in that county that they are responsible for. That helps you place them in an area of the county, in a location. So because they were living there, they were typically taking care of the roads that were in their area. They weren't going 10 miles across the county to take care of a road somewhere else. It was going to be along where they live. So those are the ones that you would want to look for. So I would encourage you to check those out, Lily, if you haven't, or if anybody hasn't checked those out before. I think that would be really helpful. Can you find, Dave said, can I find road records on the internet? Unfortunately, I have not. I won't say that you won't ever, but I have not. They are typically not well digitized out there. You're going to typically need to look at those when you go to a state archives as part of your research plan. I would absolutely check the index at the archives to see if they have them before you make a special trip down there, but that would be what you would pretty much are going to have to do those on site or ask somebody to research those for you. Now, that said, you might find them transcribed. So, for instance, if you are a North Carolina researcher, I'm trying to think what his name is, Scott Dunaway, has done a series of books on the road records for different counties in North Carolina. And what he has done was he went and he took really good digital pictures as well as transcribed the documents in those books. So you might not be able to find the actual original record online, but you might find a book that you could get through interlibrary loan or just order off of Amazon. And those would be very helpful to, you can use those as well. So that would be a good way to go if possible. Some of that really just depends on where you live and if somebody's actually done the transcriptions for those records. So that would be helpful. What era were the road records years? I don't have specific years, and that's going to really depend on the location, Debbie, as to what years. But usually I find those in the 1800s. I don't necessarily see those as much. I haven't seen them as much once I get into the 1900s, but usually it's more in the 1800s that I'm seeing that. One thing to think about, this was a story I just learned in the last few weeks for one of my great-grandfathers and this would have been in the 1920s or 1910s, 1920s, is that he got arrested apparently for drinking, and or public drunkenness. I'm not exactly sure what, but instead of a jail term, he was able to accept the alternative punishment, which was to go and work on building highways for the state. I haven't actually gotten into those records. I don't know if they're actually available for public viewing, but I thought that was an interesting thought process when it came to the roads, that was an option. So that may have been what people were doing later on. And one of his friends, and he actually did go on to work with him at times, got into road construction at that time period. And so he would go work with him at times during the off farming season so that he could have some extra money as well. So I think at that point they were starting to see more, it may have been more structured when it came to taking and building roads at that point. So Danya says she found her great-great-grandfather's payments to a doctor in the doctor payment book that had been digitized. Oh, his payment was $2. Oh my gosh, that is a really fabulous find. So you were able to find the doctor's book where he'd been digitized. That's a really neat thing. Where was the digit? Was it in a special collection? Was it like a university library type thing, Danya, or how did you find that record? I'm curious. I have seen that, and this brings up a really good point. I did a transcription. Oh, gosh, this was years ago, and it was a doctor's notes. It was basically like a little day planner, kind of this one was from the early 1900s, I believe it was, and I did the transcription of it. And they asked me, actually, the society I was volunteering with asked me to do it. One, because they thought it was so interesting, and then when they found out that because I had a medical background, they were like, I could actually read and decipher the handwriting a little bit better because I knew what some of the medical terms were. And it was really interesting because you absolutely can find, he was naming people by name, and he would talk about their ailments and what happened. And it was just a very unique aspect to look at medical care and healthcare in a time period that I think we're going to all be glad we weren't living in for healthcare, because it was kind of kind of scary stuff. But it was very interesting to learn about that and gives you a unique information about your ancestor. Don, you said the library had the doctor's collection. Yeah, that's a good thing. It was in Athens library system in Georgia. Well, that's a really interesting thing. So when you're looking for things like that, guys, you're going to find things like doctor's notes, things like that in a special collections, typically at a library, might be a university library, but that's probably where you're going to start your search first with that. But here's another tip, guys. Check out Archive Grid when you're looking for things like that in special locations. Check out Archive Grid because it will search. You guys have heard me talk about Archive Grid. You can search repositories for special collections across the U.S. I think they have, I can't remember, large number of archival materials, like over 5 million pieces of archival materials that they can search in over 1,000 repositories across the U.S. and worldwide. So that would be a good place to start. It would kind of give you, so you don't have to do individuals. So Don, you said he was one of the few doctors that treated free blacks. Interesting. What a fascinating story. I hope you write that story up, Diane. That would be a really incredible story to hear about. And hang on, Lily said she had a great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, and a brother-in-law, and one of them was arrested for bootlegging in a newspaper. Yes, I have a few bootleggers as well in mine. And that actually brings up another really interesting place. I was working for someone at one point, and I kind of lost track of this ancestor, and I couldn't quite figure out where he was. And I found him in jail, and that was a surprise. I did not expect to be searching jail records. Those are really fascinating, guys. If you get a chance to, if you have that comes up, you can find your ancestor in the jail records. Now, I'm going to be honest, the privacy laws for that from state to state vary greatly. And so in some states I can access those, others I cannot. Now, typically I will tell you those older jail records are probably not going to be online. I actually, this particular one was out of Boston, and I called up there and they said, sure, you know, the public records you have access, but they're not digitized. You have to come up here and look at them. So I actually ended up having to hire somebody to do that for me because I couldn't get to Boston. So they're a little harder to find, but if you have an ancestor, the information you find is very, very interesting. I mean, everything down to what they had in their pocket to where they were born. I've seen information on who their parents were. Just, it varies a lot, but it can be quite illuminating into your ancestor. Some of the older ones, say from the 1860s, I know that Ancestry.com has some of those jail records from like Sing Sing prison. And again, very informative about what somebody looked like, what their occupation was, where they lived, where they married, and on and on and on about that kind of thing. So there was a tremendous amount of genealogical information there that was relevant to a researcher's search. So I would encourage you to check those out. So jail records are kind of, I never expected to be finding those, and there they were. It was kind of crazy. Oh, good, Don. You're definitely going to write that one up. Yes, definitely do that. Okay, so another really interesting place that I found my ancestor, this was a female ancestor, and I was looking really, really hard for her. In fact, a research partner and I had been researching for a number of years to figure out who this woman was and to figure out who her husband was. We were researching a very common surname, the surname of White, in North Carolina and Virginia, colonial North Carolina and Virginia. That is a very common name. So it's a very difficult surname to research. And then when you have to add a woman, she was a female in there, we were struggling a lot to find this woman. And turns out, because as women did, you know, they might have more than one name because they might have been married more than once. Turns out she was. But we were able to find her in an apprentice record for a young son. And it named the son with his birth name and then with the name that he was known by because he took the stepfather's surname. So we had, and it named his mother. It named that his apprentice record named the mother. Now, I would not think to look in that apprentice record for a mother. Oftentimes, there might have been a parent named, there might not have been a parent named, just depending on the circumstances. For the 1700s in North Carolina, it's not the first record I'm going to go to. There were a lot did not necessarily survive. I mean, they did survive, but they were very spotty as far as the coverage. So many did not survive. Oftentimes, just a father's name is mentioned. You might find nobody's name mentioned if the child was an orphan. So it's just not the first place you go. So I didn't have any reason to really think she'd be there. And we stumbled upon that, and quite by accident. And I was thrilled because it really put together the piece of the puzzle that we had been missing on that particular gentleman. So that would be something I would do. Again, those are going to be archival records. You may find some of those digitized. Really depends on what the archives is doing where you're at. So Debbie asked me, where do I find apprentice records? I do find those at the archives, and they're going to be at the county level. I should back up. In North Carolina, they are at the county level typically, and that's usually where I find them in other places. But it depends on time and location as to how many you're going to find. To be honest, I think we just got lucky, but in genealogy research, we do get lucky at times. So I would encourage you to, but check those out. Again, sometimes I'm seeing some of those being digitized. You might find books that have done like very local, maybe it might be one county where they've done a transcription or made abstracts of those apprentice records, and those can be good to start your search. And certainly if you find an abstract of your ancestor being named in an apprentice record, then you would want to go and see if you can pursue getting the original document to see if there's extra information there. So try those as well. Along with that, I had a friend tell me I haven't had this experience. I have used bastardy bonds in my research, but she actually did stumble across an ancestor named in a bastardy bond, and it named the father, which was a really unusual thing for us. As when you're researching someone who was born out of wedlock, it can be very difficult to find both parents, and it did name the mother as well as the father in that one. So she stumbled upon that, looking for somebody else completely, and found that one. So that was a nice find. Lily said she had a great grandfather who died in a TB hospital prison. When you tried to check on the records, you were told the hospital was torn down, the records were destroyed. Yes, and very disappointing. It is very disappointing. It is hard to get those records if they still survived. I'm actually going to pursue something like that up in Richmond, Virginia. When things open back up, I have an ancestor who was in their state mental institute out in the western part of the state back in the 1800s. And supposedly the records still exist. So fingers crossed, I'm actually going to pursue those records as well. Would not have thought to look in that set of records. Now, the reason I am is because she appeared in what's called the DDD schedule of 1880 or 1860. And so what that is the dependent delinquent, totally blanking out on what that stands for. But it's the DDD schedule, and it named her as being in the insane asylum. That was their words, not my words, guys. So she did suffer some kind of mental health issue, but there are some of those records still available. So would not have thought to look there, except I did find that clue on the DDD schedule. Cindy says she has an ancestor who was killed in World War II in the South Pacific, and the research revealed he was buried at the Golden Gate National Cemetery. You went to visit it on Memorial Day. Tips to think you're going to visit on Memorial Day and you want to know what to do beforehand. I think that's fabulous that you know where he's buried. Probably one of the number one things I would do, Cindy, would be to call the cemetery and talk to them. Tell them who you are. Identify yourself as a relative, because sometimes as a relative, they will help you out a little bit more in the sense of that. So for instance, when I went to Arlington, and I have an uncle who was buried there, and I identified myself as having a family member there, they actually put me on a bus and took me to the grave site. So I would talk to them and make sure you know what hours they are there and how to visit, and see if you can learn a little bit more about the history. Also ask them if they have any records that you could look at. So again, the cemetery records, ask if you could look at any of those. You may be able to find some information if you, depending on how much you already know, you may find some family information you did not know beforehand, or it just may be, again, nice to have a copy of that record so that you can put that in your files. And again, maybe fill out his story a little bit more for that. But I think it's a wonderful thing, and I wish you the best of luck when you go. Make sure you have your cell phone so you can take photos and that as well. But give them a call and see kind of what they might have, what resources they might have to help you out. If it's a large cemetery, see what they have to help you find it so that you're not wandering around for a very long time trying to find it. If they can give you specific pointers on where the actual grave is, that would be great. So I think that's a wonderful, wonderful way to do things as well. All right, so let me look at my list to make sure. So here's an unusual, this might be a little bit more usual. Debbie said, at the cemetery, asked to see the record. Yes, and or at least who signed the paperwork, likely a relative. That's a good point. Debbie's bringing up, we're talking about looking at the, asking to see the records, but see who signed the records. So basically who was, kind of who, usually that's a family member, and it could be somebody you know. It may not be somebody you know, but it would be nice to have that as well, to see who did that. So yeah, good point on that. Debbie, that brings up another tip I'm going to bring up too. Sometimes when you're looking for these cemetery records, if you can get into the funeral home records, if you can get into the cemetery records, see who paid for that cemetery plot. You can see who purchased and erected a stone. Sometimes you will find that the gravestone for your ancestor wasn't put up for a number of years until after they were buried. So it may not have been done right when they were buried. It may have been a number of years by another family member. And so it's helpful to know who did that, because you can get information on other family members, even a couple generations down, that might be helpful in your research as well. So that's a really good point. And I thank you for bringing that up about seeing who signed the paperwork. That's a good idea. Absolutely. So this other one I'll share with you, I thought was kind of an unusual thing. You guys know I love photographs. Obviously, I did a webinar last night about photographs, but when I was a brand new genealogy, this is like the very first summer, few months I was doing genealogy research. My mom said, "You've got to go. We're going to go visit Aunt Joel, and we're going to get the stories from her." And so we got to her house, and she had a card table set up and a box of photographs. Now, I never would have, I don't know why I hadn't thought about it, but I was like, yeah, photographs, perfect. And so she pulls out photographs, and she has this gentleman in there, and I said, well, who is this? And she said, well, this is your great-grandfather's half-brother. And I said, well, he looks just like him, but who is it? We've never seen him. And so he was a gentleman who had been born out of wedlock, but he was well known in the family, but nobody knew his story. So when I learned about him and I shared his story, all the family members came to me and they said, how did you know? How did you learn this story? And my cousins, I looked at them and said, your mother told me. So sometimes those stories are actually not hidden. They are just in our relatives' memories, but we never know to even ask them. So it was an interesting way to find out about some ancestors I didn't even know existed. So you better believe I started asking more questions at that point to see what I could find out on that. So that was an interesting thing. So your ancestors, your genealogy is going to be in somebody's closet in a shoebox. Happens more than we like to think about, that's for sure. Now, before I close this out, guys, this has been really interesting. It's interesting to hear what kind of unusual stories you have. Go ahead and feel free, pop them, keep them coming in the comments. While I share this last thing, one of the interesting things that I find as a genealogy researcher is, if you are like me, I have taught genealogy in some of the strangest places. I've had people stop me at airports while I was waiting for a plane, and we get to talking about something, and next thing I know, we're talking about genealogy, and they're asking me advice. I've actually had somebody corner me in a gym locker room one time asking me about genealogy research and advice. Totally took me by surprise, but it was kind of an interesting thing. I've had people start talking to me about that back when I was working in physical therapy and working in healthcare. my patients would literally bring me photographs of their ancestors and say, when do you think this was taken? So these things would always just seem to find me, and it was kind of an interesting that I then eventually transitioned to do what I do now with the blog and the YouTube channel. So you never know where you're going to find genealogy. You never know where it's going to show up. You could find yourself literally in a family history book that has already been written. You can find your ancestors in a book when you walk in the library. You can find photographs in the wall of a restaurant. I had a gentleman one time relate the story. He said, I found a photograph of my father in a restaurant, on a restaurant wall one time. And so he was able to learn the story behind the photograph and go on and learn more about his father. So you never know where you might find that family history. You very well could be in formal records, but oftentimes it's those interesting things that are not the formal records that we actually find our ancestors listed in. So I would encourage you to look for the unusual and just keep your eyes open. Okay, guys, now before we close out today, I would love it if you would hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss any of the new videos that come into the Are You My Cousin YouTube channel. I will be again here live next Thursday here at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That is the usual time that you will find me online doing a live YouTube stream. So I would encourage you to get out there, enjoy that research today. Best of luck hunting for your ancestors, and I look forward to talking to you next week. Bye, guys.